love China. I like the food, I like the people, but most of all, the opportunities are real and they're exponential. And so from the entire time of anyone who's been listening to me when I came into politics in 2002, the message has pretty much always been the same, that the trend is your friend, and the trend is that China and Asia in general is going to grow rapidly. And we can have a big slice of that action relative to the size of the New Zealand economy if we want to be. And it's not really, most of it, a hell of a lot more complex than that. And I think if you really go and look at the FTA, and Michael made some brief references to it, and I know you'll talk about it today, the danger with an FTA is always, I think, that you simply say that's the end game. Actually, the FTA is a starting point. The FTA is the entree into another country's market and vice versa, the opportunity to do things together and to explore economic activity as well as a lot of other things and benefits that it brings. But actually, it's just the starting point. And unless we can use the FTA as an entree into another country's markets to make sure that people have from there the skills, capacity and capability to actually maximise that opportunity, it runs the risk of being highly devalued. And I suspect that's why you're here. Which is to try and understand how we can better leverage that opportunity. If we get it right, then it's going to be really significant. And I see those patterns evolving in my own electorate. I mean, Nick Noblo's here. We was a function I was at on Friday night celebrating 75 years of Solgen's wine in my electorate. And my electorate has a lot of fabulous wineries, and I remember over the years going and talking to them about, okay, how much wine do you sell to China? And the answer was almost pretty much, not really. Our market's America and the UK and a bit in Australia, and now every single one of them it's China. It's not that America and Australia and the UK aren't important, but there's this emerging market in China which is incredible. And you're seeing at the very top end, I guess you're seeing that with first growth French wines. You know, you want to go and buy a bottle of Chateau Lafite these days, you better take a mortgage out on a small or medium-sized house in Parnell. And that's because the Chinese are in there buying it. That's just the international demand patterns that you're seeing. So it's a very different world. So there's a few 2-minute perspectives on my life. But let me just hook through a few things, and then you'll have an opportunity to, I'm sure, to talk a little bit more. But as you're aware, we're celebrating the 40 years of diplomatic relations. We're hoping to visit China at the end of the year. You know, it is, as I say, a massive market. So if you think about what's happening, China is not only our second largest market, but New Zealand exports are now 10 times the value of the product to China that we did every day this year as we did in 1972. So we sold more in the time you were in bed last night than all of 1972, and it gives you a bit of a sense of how rapidly that's been emerging. Two-way trade's sitting at around about 13.5 billion. When I went and saw Wen Jiabao in 2010, one of the first things he said to me was, look, we want to double two-way trade to $20 billion by 2015, and we're on that pathway to do that. I know Taya's here from Fonterra somewhere in the room, and so he will, I don't know if Henry came down this morning, but Henry van der Hayden will remember the story, but I think it's worth reflecting on. China's a very interesting market, I think. It's an easy market to underestimate in terms of the capacity of the consumer to understand what's going on. I say that respectfully, but you know, it's a very large market, and so at one level we could underestimate what is interesting the Chinese consumer in New Zealand, because in my view it's very much the quality and safety of the food that we produce if you're in that business. So you'll remember years ago there was the scandal with Sanlu and a number of other milk companies in China. And so Fonterra obviously had an investment in Sanlu, very different model to the one they run in New Zealand, wasn't integrated, and so that led to this problem, and the New Zealand government of the day back then made China aware of what was going on, and the rest, as we sort of say, is history. So when I went up there in 2009, because obviously China's such a critically important market for Fonterra, we took a small business delegation and we wanted to take Henry van der Hayden with us to try and re-establish that relationship. And we were very unsure about the way that the Chinese authorities would deal with that issue, because young infants had died, and while that wasn't absolutely an issue that Fonterra had caused, Fonterra's ownership of a company that had been part of that nevertheless was a factor that was in the mix. So we advised the Chinese authorities that we were going to take Henry van der Heyden with us, and they came back and said, yeah, that's fine, which we thought, okay, that's interesting. It's good that they're doing that, but we were a bit surprised. So the day we went down to the Great Hall of the People, we had an opportunity to take, I think, 3 business leaders with us that could have their photo taken with Premier Wen. And again, one of them we decided to put on the list, top of the list obviously was Henry van der Heyden, frankly expecting them to say no. And they came back and said yes. So we took all the photos. So I was quite surprised because I thought, they would somewhat be concerned. And I had been of the view that before we went there, that the Sanlu scandal was likely to have virtually no impact on New Zealand inside China. In other words, they wouldn't sort of see much of a link there. And if it was going to do any damage at all, it would simply do damage to Fonterra's international brand because it was once you're involved in any sort of scandal, it's not good. In fact, it was the complete opposite. The international market said, look, we know that in China it was a very different deal for Fonterra, everything's fine. When we got to China, the very first thing that Wen Jiabo said to me is, our farmers are pouring their milk down the sink and you need to come and help us. And I said, okay. And he said, look, yep, we know there are problems. There are lots of problems in our food industry. We need your help to try and put better food safety standards into China. And if you can send over your technicians, have people trained in New Zealand, improve our food safety standards, then we can turn around our industry. And so rather than being concerned about Fonterra, they recognised that Fonterra was a world-class player with world-class technology. And so what ended up happening was, of course, to say the rest is history, Fonterra is investing very heavily in China. A lot of people did come from China to New Zealand. The relationship really went from strength to strength. And what you saw was Chinese consumers on the ground absolutely understood the quality of a brand, of a product that came out of New Zealand, which is why infant baby formula produced in New Zealand is growing exponentially. And the only lesson I'd sort of take out of that is Chinese consumers are absolutely no different to any other consumers. They put at the top of the list the safety and security of the food that they put in their mouth. And for New Zealand, we should never forget that as part of our branding. Because if we brand things out of New Zealand, we've got the capacity to get a premium price and to do well. And it's the same thing with our wine industry. Frankly, I think our wine industry is doing really well because it's not engaging in the low-end market where it's trying to dump product and sell things on price. It's selling on quality. And I think that's a really important thing when we go into these Chinese market, that we sometimes underestimate how powerful that brand will be and how much knowledge they have about how good New Zealand is. In terms of the summit today, there are more than just economic relationships now with China. I think there is very big people-to-people links, and that will really help us. So if you think, I think the Herald this week ran quite an interesting graph on what Auckland's going to look like in, I think it was 10 or 15 or 20 years' time, but some point in the future. And it showed this changing ethnic makeup and mix in Auckland. I think that's evident for everyone to see. Personally, I think that makes Auckland a hell of a lot more interesting place to live, and it's much better for business. We have better restaurants, better cultural events. We're a much more tolerant society as a result of it. We're actually a more interesting place to live. But those people-to-people links can be really crucial in terms of making sure that we build capacity and capability back with China as we can with the Indian community and the likes. The other thing is that we spend a lot of time talking about the brain drain to Australia. I shouldn't moan too much about it politically because I started off the argument, so fair enough. But anyway, what goes around comes around sometimes in life. So anyway, that is what it is. But if you think about what's happening, it is true that some New Zealanders pack up and go to Australia. What's also true is New Zealand's population's been rising, and rising quite rapidly in the last 20 years. So yes, people are leaving New Zealand to go to Australia because they'll see some opportunities and further afield. There are lots of Brits and lots of Australians and lots of Chinese and lots of Indians coming to New Zealand. And what's interesting with a lot of those young Chinese students that are coming is they're very interested in areas of the economy we need. They're very interested in maths, they're very interested in engineering, they're very interested in science, they're very interested in commerce. So it's not like they're coming over here to do nothing, they're coming here to make a real contribution. In my view, kind of as Prime Minister has been, look, if someone's going to come to New Zealand, study at our universities, and as long as they're of good character, frankly, if they want to stay permanently, I can't see any particular reason why they shouldn't. I think that's a great thing. They're going to be good New Zealanders and make a huge contribution. And I see it with my own son. It's like the United Nations around our house when he has his mates over there from all different ethnicities, all parts of the world, but they're all just Kiwi kids getting on with it, having a good time. And, the world is changing as we know it. So those people-to-people links, I think, are really important. We launched a China strategy at the start of the year, and the whole idea around the strategy really is to have a focal point for making sure that you as the business community can understand where we are going and what the other facets of that relationship are. One of the ones I do want to talk about is tourism. So again, if you have a think about what's happening in the world, firstly, people are travelling a lot more. So interesting enough, the number of tourist visits to New Zealand's going up, despite everything you might read and sort of think. That lots of people are travelling. About half of all the tourists that come to New Zealand are Australians. Okay, so they flock to Queenstown, but they're all over New Zealand. They come in big numbers, 1.1 million of them a year. What's been happening in recent years is there's been a decline in the traditional markets coming to New Zealand. So Vicky's here as the British High Commissioner, and we want you to hurry along your countrymen and get them to come back to New Zealand, Vicky, because they are coming, but they're coming in smaller numbers than they used to come. And that trend's been there since 2005. So it's not strictly because of the economic issues faced in the United Kingdom. There's a number of issues going on. I mean, one of them is just we live in a competitive world. So Croatia's out there pumping up its image and its attractability as a place to go. So we live in that world. But secondly, economically, as times have got a bit tougher in some parts of the world, you've seen a decline in the number of tourists coming. So the complete opposite is China. We saw a 30% increase in our tourist numbers last year from China. We've just renegotiated our Air Skies agreement, so we've got much greater connectivity. China Southern's flying in from Guangzhou every day. Effectively, they're trying to have a link from Auckland, Guangzhou through to London. And you can see the capability. I mean, we just had breakfast with a guy who's from Chongqing. So I said, how many people live there? He said 32 million. It's not insignificant, is it? I mean, it's more than all of New Zealand and Australia combined. So think about the capability there. So if we're going to do well with China on tourism, we need to think a bit differently, because if we just let the market evolve, it'll continue to evolve for a long period of time on short-run trips for Chinese tourists that come for a relatively low-quality experience that don't spend much money here. That is no good to you. You would be better to do what we do out of Germany, actually, which is we have relatively small numbers, but they spend a lot and they stay for a long period of time. Same thing with the Brits. They come here for a long time, they spend a lot of money. There is a massive, in relative terms to New Zealand, middle and upper class in China, which has huge capacity to spend money, and they want to stay in world-class hotels. Frankly, they want to go to Sky City Casino. They want to go and have a great time down in Queenstown and enjoy some of the wonderful experiences there. They're not afraid of spending money. And in fact, one of the things that we see in our tourist reports when we see them is that more often not, tourists will say, I took the $199 trip on the helicopter around Queenstown. If you'd really told me I could have rented it for the day and spent $2,000 going to Milford and everywhere else, no problem. Money's not the issue. With a lot of these consumers, money's not the issue. So we really need to think about the target audience we're going after, because there's some very, very wealthy people who are quite prepared to spend a hell of a lot of money in New Zealand. So that, I think, is hugely important. The only other last point I want to make, and then I'll hand over, is if you think about what's happening, if you want my view of what's happening in the world, is you are seeing China emerging as a superpower. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think there'll always be people who have a variety of different views, but it's inevitable. It's happening, and China's economic wealth is rising rapidly. So we know that they've got trillions of dollars in cash. We know they're heavy consumers from the Chinese government side in New Zealand bonds and Australian bonds and the likes. So no problem. We are going to see more Chinese investment in New Zealand, and if you go roll back the clock to the start of the year when there was the Shanghai Penjing bid for Crayford Farms and some of the political pushback from other political parties over there. I reckon that is a really short-sighted thing to do, because in my view, if someone's prepared to come to New Zealand, make a serious investment in New Zealand and create jobs and create a product that can lift economic value and move us up the value chain, we want that. And frankly, whether it comes from China, South Africa, America, Australia, I don't care. All I want is people to make quality investments in New Zealand. I mean, I've been on the record saying that, look, I don't think the wholesale sale of New Zealand farms is necessarily in New Zealand's best interest. I think it's inevitable you're going to sell some farms, just like it's inevitable that Fonterra is investing heavily in some very big farming operations in China. That's the way of it. But if we're just selling farms with no other change, we're not delivering on the capability we want. But if we're going to get the sorts of things you've seen that are tied up in the Shanghai Penjing bid, which is potentially very large distribution capability into retail China, the creation of products tailored for the Asian market, significant investment in job creation in New Zealand, then we as New Zealanders actually have to think about the future we want. And if we're going to sit around and say, excuse me, if we're going to sit around and say, we want our young kids to go to university, come out with a world-class education and be paid a good, decent, high wage, and therefore be encouraged to stay in New Zealand, they've got to have those jobs to go to. They've got to have the big operations to run, the big scientific-based projects to work on. And if we're just going to reject foreign investment in New Zealand, given the state of the capital markets in New Zealand's economic development has to go backwards. It's as simple as that. Yep, we're lifting our national savings rate and that is good, but we're still a long way away from funding all of the investment we need. So if I go back to where I sort of started, if you ask me what's going to happen in 20 years' time, when the Prime Minister of the day, whoever that may be, stands up here and opens this conference, it'll be a much bigger conference. The relationship will be even deeper. We'll be talking about what we were doing back in 2012, and we'll be arguing that was the real tip of the iceberg of what's possible. If we're not talking that way, we've failed, because the issue isn't China. With or without us, China is growing, it's going to expand, and it's going to get a lot wealthier. It's buying those products, it's consuming those services, and it's making a huge difference in the world. The question only is whether New Zealand gets its slice of the action. Personally, I think we should grab it with both hands, and that's why I've been very supportive of the relationship in the time I've been Prime Minister. Thanks very much.